Today is the first of our three-part webinar series on the Bay Area Seize the Narrative Playbook, the results of our months-long coalition-driven, research-informed initiative to advance housing and racial justice in the Bay Area. We're so honored to have Dr. Tiffany Manuel, who is the CEO and founder of The Case Made and has been a longtime advisor and partner in our Bay Area efforts. Today, she is going to walk us through the core recommendations from the playbook.
So at the top of this thing, I want to say, just, really getting clear, this is a project about shifting the narrative, which means we're acknowledging that the narrative that exists is often around housing is not often where we need it to be to advance what we would talk about as housing justice, not just, some better housing options, but really thinking about the way that housing and equity and the issues around that combine powerfully when we do this work well. And the narrative, I would say, is challenging for us. It's not that people don't care about where they live. When we did some of the community voice sessions around this work, it was very clear. Housing was one of the number one things that people wanted to talk about. When you asked them what they wanted policymakers to solve, they didn't mince words. They didn't stutter. They weren't unclear. They were like, oh, I don't know. I mean, they were very clear. Solve this. This is a problem. And I think one of the things that we recognize is that people are often stuck in a way of thinking about this issue that is just totally unproductive, what we might call dominant narratives. They're stuck in a frame about people as having individual responsibility and why can't they, or stuck in a frame about housing as a commodity and, housing equity and what they think they should get out of it, or they're stuck in this us versus them, homeowners versus renters. Those renters are having problems and not my problem. Whatever that is, we need a way to unpack some of that conversation. And mostly to get strategic about what we're looking at. There are some of those narratives that are actually, when we unpack them, pretty helpful, right? Some of those narratives, if we just take them and kind of reframe them a little bit, can be very helpful to what we're trying to advance, but we got to reshape them a little bit. Some of those narratives are just so deeply ugly and othering and so deeply dehumanizing that we're not going to even have that conversation. We at the end of the playbook, we had some of those narratives we just pivot and avoid, and we're not going to have a conversation about people's humanity. Then there were some narratives that we've encountered, but also that some of the national research that Alina was talking about, and some of the work that has been done locally by AMC, where we tested out some values to see here's some values that we hear people talking about. That what's the strength of those values? If we amplify those values in our narratives, can we get people even more to lean forward? And so you see in the playbook, a way of thinking about what are the values that are already in play, right? But they need amplification. They need to be scaled. They need us to blast them out. They need the repetition of our time and our interests and our stories. So we start this off just by introducing at a high level. I'm gonna just flip through these slides. Just talking about at a high level, like what is narrative to begin with? And the reason I have to say I love this, Rashad, I probably should pay Rashad Robinson a fee at this point because I've been using some of his stuff so much in the work that I do. In fact, I probably should. And the reason I say that is because he's really good about the idea of what narrative should be doing, right? It's not that, a narrative is just the way that you tell a story. It's right in and of itself, that's really very simple. But what he tries to do is to be prescriptive. Like a narrative should open up people's sense of agency, should open up a sense that something can be done and give them a role. Like we need you to do something, right? And tell them why it matters. And especially, I would say, in this moment where there's so much opportunity to kind of engage people differently, if you look at your narrative and it's depressing the hell out of the people that you're talking to, then you probably got the wrong one. So we do a little bit of intro into this, just getting people clear, not just about the 3 Ps across the area, but really talking about this notion of housing justice and what that means in the context of the work at the Bay, and then giving kind of 5 key points of what we were trying to do with this work so that people really understand why it's so important. This is probably, for me, I think, hopefully one of the simplest and one of the most important, and also one of the ones that y'all should, no matter what you do, this is this is critically important, especially at this time, which is just name the power of the moment. And I would say, don't underestimate the fact, or don't assume that all Bay Area folks kind of really get the power that we're seeing in this moment to create change. This is a really moment to sort of go big or go home. this is a really important moment to not just be sort of saying, well, how do we get some more units over here, this part of the Bay, or a couple units there? This is like, no. This is about the fact that we have made a housing system that does not produce equity, that is patently in and of itself sort of baked and steeped in sort of structural racism, that is not sustainable over the, right, it's not sustainable. Start by talking about like, hey folks, the world is changing around us. Like in this, how we are responding in this moment, it matters, right? We can't keep kicking the can down the road or pretending as if some of these issues don't require immediate action. And so your ability to kick that off really matters. We got a chance to see what are the values that show up most powerfully. But this legacy that we owe our children is a consistent winner. When people get that value system, they start thinking about the fact that their own children can't afford to live in the Bay, and they're mad about that. And man, what does that mean? I have to move because my children are moving away. And so that value system, lifting that up, makes people start to grapple with what's needed because they feel some dissonance around that. And so it helps us to make our case. Reframing, we found in part of a lot of this work, there are a lot of places where the conversation about loss was really important. People who know me, they know I talk about this a lot. The sort of loss framing and loss aversion is huge. And I would say there are two things that you need in a message. You need a gain frame and you need a loss frame. The gain frame is your value statement. That tells people what they get when they work with us. What you get is a Bay Area that's affordable for you and for your children to live here. What you get is health and well-being. What you get is that we're putting people first. What you get is a region that's stronger. That's a gain frame. But what I will tell you, if you're also not queuing up and telling people what they lose, right, that doesn't have the power of a full message, right? Gain frame is strong, but it's not strong enough to pull people forward. If you don't know what people are afraid to lose and you're not communicating that in the context of a message, you do not have what you need to pull them forward. When people think about affordable housing, they often are thinking about, if I support this, what am I going to lose? If these folks move into my community, and you know who these folks are, I'm going to lose the property values in my neighborhood. I'm going to lose that view of the park that I love, because they're going to try to build buildings that are high and have more density, and I'm going to lose my view. It's going to create more traffic, and so and so they're ticking off in their heads all the things that they lose. And so you and I have to get lost back on the other side of that table, which is no. What you should be concerned about is what you're going to lose if you don't work with us and help us to figure this out. You're going to lose everything you love about the Bay Area because you're not leaning into what we need to plan for our future. So this one should be easy for folks. Center equity. I don't care what conversation you're having. I don't care who you're having. I don't care if you're talking to somebody who doesn't care about equity. This is, for me, and I hope you all agree, this is about unseating some dominant narratives that are challenging, but we just have to do the work. You'll see in the playbook some pretty important language about lifting up the history of exclusionary policies and structural racism. Having people acknowledge where that is very important, especially for people of color. It's like if we're having a conversation and you're not going to acknowledge what has happened in the past, it's hard to move forward, right? And so I would say, in order to keep your base, right, moving forward, that acknowledgement is important, and it's important to position that. You don't want to linger there throughout the whole conversation because it is challenging. Some of the national research that, the Funders for Housing Opportunity did said, listen, this conversation about history and exclusionary policies didn't get very far. And that may be true, but you got to have that acknowledgement. Otherwise, folks who would want to lean in don't feel like this is a real thoughtful effort around these issues. So attach. There are a lot of narratives that are happening outside of housing that are particularly productive, especially in the health space, racial justice. And this was just a nod to say, acknowledge what those narratives are. Some of them are actually pretty helpful. Some of those narratives were some of the strongest narratives that got people to support housing policy. So, those narratives on health and well-being, some of the strongest, right, policy, the framing that got people moving forward. But this is also important because it allows us to bring other sectors in as partners in a thoughtful way. Mobilize. This is about being willing to go beyond the usual suspects. We already have a lot of folks on the same page. And I know this is hard because some folks are like, let's just get the base riled up and we're going to move the base. Yes, that is true. But if we don't bring some other people to the table, right, we don't have the power that we need to have transformative policies. Reaching beyond our usual suspects is important. And so there's some language about how we begin to have a bigger coalition around this stuff. And a part of it is, which is, this may be counterintuitive, is to put housing back in the driver's seat of some of these issues. Counter. So there are narratives that they're just misinformation. And so just countering the logic of some of that misinformation. We try to represent some of those things here, but you all probably also know some of those things. And you will know, you start to figure out what are the narratives that can easily be countered when you push on them a little bit and people go, okay, yeah. Those are not the dominant. Dominant narratives, when you push on them a little bit, they push people in the opposite direction, and then they go off with passionate stuff about why you are wrong, right? That just sends people in. You go down a rabbit hole when you get to a dominant narrative, and when you hit one of those things. And it's not that you can't unseat those dominant narratives. It just means that it takes a longer period of time. We need a cultural shift of counter messages over time to get to those. But there are some of those that are just misinformation that can be countered. And so we try to give some of those right here. And the last one was, so our good old friends, these really strong dominant narratives, the stuff that is just hard because people, they're deeply embedded kind of stuff that we've been consuming our whole lives because we live in this culture. The notion that home ownership is the only way to have stability in a community, and you have to be a homeowner and it has to look like a single family home is what is at the top of the hierarchy. And if you don't have that with, 2-car garage, a dog, a cat, white picket fence, like that kind of, oh boy, the American dream kind of stuff. So there are a set of narratives that are just, it's not they cannot be overcome, but in the short term of trying to get stuff done, some of that might be better or more usefully addressed by pivoting around some of that stuff. And so I give some advice and counsel here about how to do a successful pivot. You can say, you know what, as long as it's not about, my humanity, right? If it's some of these other things, I share your concern about the community, but that's why I believe that our health and well-being is best addressed if we really lean into this issue of affordable housing. Because when we do that, XYZ happens. Or, you know what, you put a number of issues on the table, or you can even put it in writing. There are a number of issues that folks have laid out about this issue, but it really all comes back to, at the end of the day, are we putting people first? If we're doing that, and that's our central operating modality, then you have to look at what's happening in housing and say we can do better. There are a couple of different templates in the guide that are trying to help you begin to speak to different audiences. We know that we've got at least 3. For now, the 3 that people tend to think about when we think about our audiences, we got folks who are already in support of affordable housing. They're already there. There's a way in which we can line up that message along these ends. Then there are folks who are what I call bystanders. I know some folks call them persuadables, right? Persuadable, I call them bystanders. They're not getting, they may even see something's wrong with what's happening, but they're not getting involved. They're not leaning in the way we need them to. And so they need a stronger message and they need some additional things. And you can see the architecture, like naming the power of the moment, either using one of those framing, attaching and or reframing, centering equity, countering some of the misinformation that's keeping them from leaning in, and then mobilizing and asking for a call to action. And then there are good friends, the contrarians, the ones who, no matter what you say, they don't really care. They're never gonna come through. But those of us who are in a position where you have to talk to those contrarians because they're standing in the way between you and systems change. There may be some legislators in this camp. There may be some, you do your best with them. Name the moment, try to reframe the conversation in terms of what they lose if they don't support what we're trying to do. Center the conversation about equity. Do not miss the opportunity, even amongst our contrarians, to center equity, and then pivot and avoid. Get away from the stuff that is just, listen, we're not talking that conversation. So what my narratives look like on this may end up being slightly different. But what this presentation is about is, are there elements of those narratives that we can all be using together and in tandem that help us have a much more powerful, not just conversation, but that becomes repetitive enough that people hear it enough in enough places where it starts to be kind of the way that Bay Area folks think about the world, right? And then that helps us over time to not have to fight so hard for basic things that are about basic human dignity, right, for folks across the region. So I'm going to stop there. That was a lot and a little bit of span of time, but hopefully we've got plenty of time for Q&A, to ask questions, and to talk about next steps if folks are interested.